This presentation is about editing quotations and references. Editing quotations and references requires the following from an editor: knowing the technical minutiae of the style you're working with and of general documentation conventions overall, and to know how to incorporate source material. The point here is that you have to be familiar with some of the basics, but also with the specifics of what you're working with. So first, references. We could also call references documentation, and so it helps to put these things in terms of sort of categories. The first, documentation can be in two categories, the first one being parenthetical. Parenthetical literally means it involves parentheses. So for this to document a source, it has to appear twice. Number one, it has to appear in the actual text of the manuscript, inside parentheses, some information about that reference. And then there should also be a corresponding entry in a list of sources. For notational, there are 3 points that we see a reference. There's an in-text citation by a superscript number. There's a corresponding entry in a footnote or endnote, meaning at the bottom of the page or at the end of the document. And then lastly, there's another list where that reference will be. So there's the parenthetical and there's the notational. Here's some examples. Common parenthetical would be MLA, APA. Chicago has its own one called the author date format, and the IEEE style. Common notational ones, Chicago has its own notes bibliography format. There's Turabian. There's a scientific style and format. So here's a quick glance at the way these things differ for these common parenthetical ones. Notice APA has different information in the parentheses, includes the year and the page number, and the way that it treats the two authors with a ampersand. Look at the way it does its reference at the end. The sentence style, there's no quotations. The way that it treats the author's first names with just the initial. So there are just these little differences. Notice the way that the volume number 25 is treated versus the issue 1. So things where it's just a matter of detail. Looking at MLA, you can see they don't care about the year in the parenthetical. There's some different structure in the reference. Notice also the headings. When you have that list of sources in APA, it's called references, but in MLA, it's called works cited. So it's important to get the terminology correct to speak credibly as an editor. For Chicago's author date format, notice it includes the same information as APA, but it doesn't include a comma before the page number. It uses quotation marks, uses headline style in the title of the article, has some spacing issues between the volume and the issue. So just differences there, and it's a matter of getting used to it with what your author or writer needs to use. So for IEEE, notice how it does pages, or parentheticals, when brackets rather just parentheticals spoken of loosely, it's actually brackets. And the source are numbered based off when they appear. Notice the way that the reference appears. There's an abbreviation for the title of the periodical. And so consult a table like this one when you have to figure out how to abbreviate certain terms. So the Journal of Business and Technical Communication, journal is always just J, as you can see from the table. Business is BUS, technical is always TECH dot, and then communication, commune. So it just corresponds with what the journal title is. Notice they actually spell out volume, they spell out number, they use PP for the page numbers. Now for editing quotations. So incorporating sources. This is a little bit basic, but it's important to review it for an editor. Quoting is when you use the exact words, sentences, or phrases from the original. Notice the use of punctuation at the end of the quotation. There's a quotation mark followed by the parenthetical for the page number, then finally the period. For paraphrasing, you use your own words in place of the material. Notice the placement of the period. Notice there are no quotation marks because you're not quoting. And then for summaries, you just talk about larger main points. And these examples use APA. So some requirements: if you're quoting, do you use quotation marks? Yes. Do you cite? Yes. Do you use a page number? Yes. For paraphrasing, you don't use quotation marks, but you are paraphrasing, so you need a citation and a page number. And for summary, yes, you need a citation, but there's no page number because you're talking about larger main points. Now for some specifics about treating quotations. So when you need to edit them, there are some permissible changes that you can make, for example, to punctuation, capitalization, or spelling. You can change the dashes if they're misusing them. For example, if they use a hyphen instead of an end dash when they need to use an end dash. You can change the initial letter to a lowercase if you're incorporating it with your own writing. You can incorporate appropriate punctuation, and if there are obvious typographical errors, you can use the word sick, which we'll talk about in a moment. You can also change the typography if necessary, the way the typeface appears. Now, when you're talking about choosing between run-in and block quotations, usually if there's about 100 words or more, you want to set it off as a block quotation, which is literally when you press return, indent the material over and have a large quotation. And then the way that you would assimilate the quoted text into the writing really is a matter of knowing logic and grammar. So the narrator's constant references to, and here comes the quotation, malicious code and obsolete data, detract from a more fundamental issue. So the point being that it flows logically and grammatically into the writer's writing, even though it's using a quotation. So it takes some thinking about quoting it logically and grammatically correct. For using commas to introduce a quotation, you can use them after words like said, replies, asked, and so on. But when the quotation is first, the comma is required also at the end of the quotation before the quotation mark. When a quotation introduced mid-sentence and it just incorporates with the writing of the writer, you don't need a comma, as in this case. Donovan made a slight bow and said he was very glad. No comma after was. You can also use a colon, but only when the introductory part of the quotation is an independent clause. So here's an example. Faraday's conclusion was alarming. Independent sentence, colon, and then here comes the quotation mark. Unless it's introduced by as follows or other wording that requires a colon, a block quotation may be preceded by a period. So you don't need to use a colon unless you say the following. So-and-so said the following. Here comes a block quotation. Or some other requirement for a colon. You can just use a period. When you're running in the quotation with the writer's writing, you can make the initial capital or lowercase depending on the way it's being used. Aristotle believed that, and then even though that would be a sentence that would be complete and should be capitalized in the original Aristotle, because it's being incorporated into the quotation, it's lowercased. But Aristotle put it this way, colon, and now it's capitalized because that's how it appeared in the original. And for the capitalization rules are the same for block quotations. You can use brackets to indicate changes you've made in capitalization. So let us compare Aristotle's contention that inferiors revolt in order that they may be equal and equals that they may be superior. Notice we obviously changed the I in inferior to a lowercase, and the editor can make a bracket around that to indicate that change. So when there are quotes within quotes, you simply need to use single quotation marks. To say that I mean what I say, so it's a quote within a quote, is the same as I say what I mean. So in other words, for that quote within a quote, it's surrounded with single quotation marks. Indirect discourse is what paraphrases dialogues, and so it doesn't need quotation marks. Very well, you say, but is there no choice? So even though you, whoever I'm talking to, said that, it's sort of indirect. So ellipses are what we might just call ... You've seen them before, but it can be tricky to think about how to use them correctly. Don't use them before the first word of a quotation, even if you know that you omitted the first part of that quotation, and don't use them after the quotation, even though you know you omitted some more information from the quotation. Simply, you don't need it. But the trickiness comes with when do you need ... for, and that's when it's a matter of using a period. A period is added before an ellipsis to indicate omission of the end of a sentence, unless it's deliberately incomplete. The spirit of our American radicalism is destructive and aimless, period. ... On the other side, the Conservative Party is timid. So here, there is an omission, But the point rather is that this is not the end of a sentence. The Conservative Party. That is not a sentence, but the first part was a independent sentence, so it did need an additional dot. So you can sense it's a matter of whether there's a complete sentence or not, whether you need 4 or 3. For other punctuation like commas, colons, semicolons, question marks, or exclamation points, they can come before or after an ellipsis. It just depends on the sentence. If it's a deliberately incomplete sentence, you only need the 3 dots rather than the 4. So that goes back to the previous slide. The spirit of our American radicalism has been deliberately shortened, so you only need 3. Now back to sick, which I brought up earlier. It literally means something like so, thus, or in this manner, and the way that you use it or treat it is in italics, and it's inserted in brackets following a word that was misspelled or wrongly or awkwardly used in the original. J.W. Chaffin urged Lincoln that the confiscation law passed at the last session of Congress. Now we know that that word passed is misspelled, misused. It should be P-A-S-S-E-D, and an editor can indicate it that was wrong in the original by using sick, italics, in brackets. And sometimes this is important for historical writing, when often words were used differently in previous generations. And that's editing quotations and references. Consult these slides as a cheat sheet rather than using Chicago, but in some cases you will need to use Chicago or some other manual because the slides won't cover all of the details.